Welcome to JSA TV Europe, together with the Greener Data Movement for this quarter's live event focused on European digital infrastructure sustainability. I'm Jean-Marc Lim, and joining me today is Stephen Beard, partner Knight Frank. And Stephen, welcome so much to JSA TV. You're at an airport to go to another industry event. First of all, I hope you're doing well. Secondly, let's talk about data center developments and how sustainability plays in that. So when you're someone that has your fingers in a lot of pies, and very interesting pies, to be honest, in a lot of very interesting regions and markets across EMEA, when looking at a greenfield and general data center developments, expansions, how important is it green power and sustainability in the decision-making process?
Yeah, thanks, Joan, and thanks very much for having me. Apologies for being in an airport environment. But to answer the question directly, our data center development teams are helping operators and hyperscale alike acquire new brownfield and greenfield development across all global markets. What I can say is that 80% of those clients are embracing the required change in approach. The majority of the 20% tend to be in emerging markets or where the modern day ESG fundamentals are yet to arrive. Ultimately, they will come on board because that's just natural market evolution. But the first starting point really with any client is analysing the makeup of the transmission network in terms of its renewable components. Of course, the Nordics blows every other market out of the water, with the likes of Iceland and Norway representing 100% and 99% respectively. When you compare that to Germany and the UK, it's 45 and 40% respectively. So with that information in hand, most of our clients will say, okay, well then how can we improve the renewable power that we're receiving to our site? So they'll engage with DNOs in order to make sure that the DNO can guarantee that the power coming to the data center facility is 100% renewable, and they'll pay for the benefit in that. If that isn't always possible, then of course the next step is looking at investing directly onto on-site or off-site renewable production. So whether that be solar, onshore wind, gas turbines, etc., etc. I think really the key big change going forward, hopefully from a European perspective alone, will be the future adoption of nuclear power. Now, obviously, that's not a renewable component, but it certainly is a recyclable and certainly better than what we've got today.
That's very interesting. You mentioned quite a few interesting things. So nuclear power, of course, being one of them. I mean, we know that's a big topic in France and the UK especially. But then also the investment by operators into renewable farms, and we've seen that a lot, especially in Southern Europe. Speaking in Southern Europe, when you look at the markets and beyond the Nordics, what other regions are benefiting the most from green power investments?
Yeah, I think ultimately, when you look further afield, you've got to look at those locations which have good access to offshore wind farms and natural daylight. So those southern European countries, the likes of Spain, Portugal, and Athens, which too, very interestingly, are also benefiting from the plethora of subsea cables interconnecting those locations with the rest of the world. So there's a perfect mix, particularly in southern Europe at the moment, where we're seeing huge inbound inquiries, as I say, in the likes of Athens, Lisbon, and obviously Madrid.
Well, three very interesting markets, and I'm not biased at all when it comes to Lisbon.
Of course, of course.
But I mean, Madrid, Lisbon, and Athens are very interesting, and I'll probably add in Milan to that list as well within the southern European sphere. But when we look into ESG within the industry and sustainable developments, there's been quite a lot of conversations around the good, the bad, and the ugly. How would you rate what people are doing nowadays around data center ESG, and especially green power? And what do you think we need to do more?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, you know full well, that you can't go to any conference now without people leading with the idea of sustainability. And I think the market has started to take a more proactive approach. I think, for the last 5-6 years, we've all been talking a really good game. And let's be frank, inherently there has been an element of greenwashing and people talking about, meeting the carbon emission targets of the largest 3 hyperscale in the world. I think now, though, we are starting to see, radical changes in terms of the way we approach our design. A lot of data center operators now are looking at prefab modular construction. Even the likes of EcoDC are looking at fabricated timber technology. Would you believe? Building a data center with wood is quite a radical approach. I think more interestingly as well, going forward, we're seeing parties look to water now as one of the other key considerations as part of their design and operation historically we've always analysed an operator's ESG metrics based on PUE, which has made a lot of sense. And I think ultimately the industry should shout louder about the improvements we've made to PUE. It wasn't that long ago when we were talking about 1.8, 1.9, and now we're kind of 1.3 as a standard. But there aren't enough parties that are looking at water usage effectiveness. And so I anticipate going forward that a lot of parties will look at, priding themselves on their WUE numbers. I think also in terms of the design, if you look at, say, the BBC Panorama program that came out a couple of weeks ago, it's fairly one-sided. Yeah, I had to bring it up, right? I'm based here in the UK, and it's BBC is our home terrestrial TV show. But it was a very one-sided approach. But I think, as I said, they did raise a really good point in relation to water usage, and that's something that I think that we have to change. But what I would add is that on any development site we're working on today with our clients, the first thing we do is we look at the potential to create a district heating network, and it is possible if there's an off-taker within a distance not too far away. You mentioned before we came on the call. Yesterday there'd been an announcement about a swimming pool that was being heated by the excess heat produced by a data center. There's a number of residential developments throughout Europe that have the same benefit. So there are radical changes when it comes to design, operation. And I think that's a really key thing for the industry to be shouting about.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen as well that one of the Paris 2024 Olympics pools is going to be heated by a data center, an Equinix data center. So it's the message is starting to get there slowly. But how do you think we can tell this message better to the wider audience? Because often when we talk to ourselves in the industry, and this is from the industry, for the industry, by the industry, and the conversation needs to shift a little bit more towards the wider public, to also help shape the public opinion of what data centers are and what data centers do and their contribution to the economy and to everyone's daily lives. I mean, this data centers got us through COVID, essentially without a massive job market fallout, like what happened during the Spanish flu. So how do you think the industry can tell the story better around data center sustainability to encompass the wider public?
Yeah, I think, again, inherently, given the nature of the critical nature of the IT infrastructure that's being housed within these data centers, we as an industry are very opaque. We don't like making too much noise about entities that are taking space. We don't like making too much noise about the fact that we are consuming lots of power historically, but we are making changes. I think we've got to be a lot louder. I think the industry has to come together much more. It's a little bit too fractured. Fundamentally, the layman, as you rightly said, doesn't really truly understand the benefits of a data center from an environmental, from a social, from a financial, and from a governance perspective. And we need to do more to educate the masses. As you said, the COVID vaccine was found within an algorithm that was housed in a data center. So too was the Ebola vaccine as well. I don't think enough people recognize that every click, swipe, and tap we make online goes through a data center. And as you rightly say, it ultimately was the network that held up when everyone was working through at home through COVID. So fundamentally, there has to be parties like yourself and Knight Frank and our competitors to really come together and start singing and shouting about all the positive impact that the data center sector is having.
Absolutely. I mean, you expanded on the life sciences aspects with COVID vaccines and Ebola. I mean, what's happening within that space alone, it's amazing. Because this eventually, and not taking away, maybe not being too wide on discussion, but eventually this is where cure for everything that we face in cancers and everything else is going to come from. It is through these data houses, processing these massive amounts of data. So computing centers more than data centers. Yeah,
exactly. And I think to be fair that there is a lot of negative sentiment with data centers generally, and we're finding this across the board throughout Europe now, because most average people who don't know much about data centers, the average person, they just assume that data centers don't employ anybody and just consume lots and lots of power. And of course, the scale of growth within our sector is astronomical. But what you have to remember is that it's all relative. The creation, the adoption of public cloud is less than 10 years old. It's a bit like saying that if we were to suddenly build houses, let's say we never had houses before construction for the world's population, of course there'd be an unbelievable amount of development. So that's all that's happening. It's just a rapid acceleration. And of course, it will plateau in time, with greater efficiencies and greater efficient technologies, and we're seeing that across the board now. One of the stats that I wasn't that happy with in the BBC Panorama program was talking about and highlighting the data centers market's contribution to world global power consumption being around 3%. But that stat's been there for 5 years. So actually what it shows is that we're being much more efficient with the way that we're developing and operating and ultimately using these facilities. I mean, it's quite a radical thing to say, but, perhaps we should start looking at the end users, those people like you and I who are using data, wasteful data on a daily basis, because I think that's the key topic here. It's wastefulness. And that goes throughout the spine of the sector. It starts at the top with the hyperscale, who are taking too much space and too much power that they're not even using. Then it starts with the data center operators, who then have to buy more land and reserve more power than they're actually using. It's the CTOs who are putting all their compute in one location because it's just a lot easier from a contracting and an operating standpoint. But ultimately, it's the end users like you and I and everyone else who are wastefully watching videos in airport lounges, waiting for a flight or swiping on Tinder or whatever it may be. Ultimately, it has to start with the end user, and there has to be some form of taxation or cap on people's ability to use wasteful data.
You touched on two very important aspects of the whole discussion, because those 3% of gas emissions that data centers produce worldwide. First, I don't think it's 3% anymore. I think it's slightly less. But I did see a study once, which I can't remember who did it. It was one of those universities that calculate those things in theses and postgraduates. If nothing had changed over the last, as you said, 5-10 years, data centers will now account to 20-25% of gas emissions. So the fact that this industry is, I don't know if it's doubling in size every year, but the fact, let's say it's doubling nearly in size every 2 or 3 years, and the gas emissions kind of remains the same, it's quite promising, especially with all the investment that's going in now into renewable energy, and which is showing how the industry is what to do as well. And then what you say about for sure, because we don't need to store 10,000 pictures of a cat on our Facebook page, on our Facebook timeline. Neither we need to have 200 apps on our phones and use all of them at the same time. So that
I mean, and you make a good point. It's about the investment, and whilst the data center operators and the management teams within those, those are the guys that are engaging with the end users and the hyperscale on a daily basis, and they're hearing firsthand, the management team, how important ESG is to the end user. And that's great to see. We all talk about the carbon emission targets of Microsoft and Amazon and Google as of 25 and 30. The issue at hand really is convincing the investors that sit behind the management teams to actually go and spend more money on developing truly green facilities. And it's quite a perverse thing for an investor to consider. When we've been seeing 5 to 6 years of MEP cost inflation, where we're up at 9, 10, 11, $12 million per megawatt of IT for fit out, to tell the investor, hey, look, I want us to make sure we're building the greenest data center. And so we want to have certified green concrete, certified green steel. We want to have a district heating network, tick, 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 tick. And we want it to inflate the overall construction cost by 20%. The investor's going to turn around and say, what, are you crazy? But it requires a complete change of mentality from the investor to recognize that, it's all relativity. If you're building the greenest, cleanest data center, then it's going to be much more appealing to the end user. So it's going to enhance your credibility and lettability, and more importantly, the rental tone. So I think as soon as those management teams can really convince the investors, and we've got, proof of concept somewhere in Europe where someone does develop the truest, greenest data center, has managed to charge a premium for the benefit, then I think everything else will cotton on. But clearly, it all comes down to money, right? And we've got to be able to convince those investors who are deploying that capital that it's worth doing so.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this industry, though, the funny thing is that there's a lot of capital. It's just how do you tell the stories to get the capital out of the door on the ground to build those kind of. Stephen, I'm not going to expand too much on what you said because I know you have to leave on top of the hour, so we've got just a few minutes left. What's Knight Frank doing at the moment, and what's the focus going to be over the next 12, 18 months around data center developments in Europe?
Yeah, thanks. We have a bit of a saying. I mean, you've probably heard it before. I mean, we try and put the operator's hat on, if you like, and rather than chasing cloud, we like to get ahead of it. So, I like to spend my time in emerging markets where we can certainly see the governments of those countries start to look at tendering to public cloud, which will obviously be the catalyst for growth in that sector. So we do a lot of upfront analysis on existing smaller retail platforms that would be ripe for M&A, brownfield development that we could proposition and position as being a viable leading next best data center development site. So that's probably why when you look at us on LinkedIn, you'll see us at the front end of the market in new challenging locations. But ultimately, that's because we want to help those markets become much more efficient and much more appealing. So we want to reduce those barriers to entry. So hopefully we're a conduit and a positive conduit at best.
What you're doing, especially the developments and your announcement last week in part of agility. That was very interesting. I think what's going to come will be quite a nice story to see unfold. And then, Stephen, so if I'm a developer and investor, if I'm someone in this space that wants to learn more about what you do and wants to reach out, how can I do that?
Just drop me an email. We've got a big team below us. There's a team of 17 guys now based out of London. We've got a team of 6 in Singapore and a team of 9 based out of the west coast of the US. So we're always open to conversations, and I can guarantee the guys will get back to you in 24 hours.
24 hours. That's quite a statement. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me.
They're probably watching this now, thinking.
Yeah.
Not at all. Yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you for your time.
I'll see you at the next conference.
Yes, and as for you viewers at home, thank you for tuning to JSA Europe TV Live. Don't forget to check our social channels for more content. Until next time, happy networking.